Yes, yes, we're good to go. Thank you.
All right. So we move into the second initiation. And one of the important things about the second initiation is it's that it's said to be one of the most difficult. So those of you who may be preparing for the second initiation, just realize it's viewed that way. And just like with the first initiation, there was that theme around the idea that the soul takes dominion over the physical appetites. When we look at it from the second initiation perspective, this is where the soul is trying to demonstrate a measure of mastery over the emotional dimension of the personality. And that there's some unique challenges associated with that is why one of the reasons why it still takes a few incarnations to fully complete it. So that's the kind of the underlying principle of the second initiation, is the mastery of the emotional body, or the relative mastery, that is. And there's a reason for that in a couple sense. One of the things is that as you develop yourself and you're working toward the second initiation, you become aware that there's more glamour in your consciousness than you might realize. And so you become, and again, the word glamour means distortions, and it's often inflamed by emotion. So the subject of how to have emotion, and yet at the same time not be victimized by it. How to put it another way, it's all about learning how to use emotion and not be used by emotion. That's a way we at it. The emotional body is so pervasively present that its influence is quite profound, and yet the whole journey is to really learn how do we learn how to use our instruments without actually being identified with them.
Pin volume up there. No, that's the one that's taped. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, William.
Everything okay?
Yes, sorry about that. I didn't know you could hear me there.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. So I'll go ahead and continue then. Okay. So this is all about how to use your emotions in such, well, the whole path is about how to use your instruments, mental, emotional, and physical, and not be identified with them. So it has nothing to do with repression at all, zero to do with repression. And I think that's why one of the reasons why the second initiation is so difficult is because emotions are so capturing of us, and yet at the same time we don't want to repress emotion either, because psychologists have long told us that can lead to a whole other set of problems. So it's this mystery of how do you use emotion and yet not identify with it. I often like to share a great master once said this, and it's been one of my favorite phrases for years. It's sort of a metaphor. It goes like this: always remember that you are the director on the stool, and never leave the stool to become one of the characters on the stage. What do I mean by that? You are the beingness behind the experiences of thought, feeling, and physical impulse. You are the director. You as a soul are the director. Don't jump off the stool and become one of the characters on the stage. And what are the characters? The characters on the stage, that's just a metaphor for the emotions that pop up, the thoughts that arise, the physical impulses toward action. And in this case, we're focusing on emotion. So the emotions that come up, those are the characters on the stage. And there's a tendency of the self to leave the stool and jump onto the stage and play in that world, whereas we want to direct that world and not play in it, so to speak. And that's kind of a fun metaphor to think about it this way. Some of the characteristics that we are told are involved in demonstrating readiness for the second initiation is this. For instance, we're told that the individual has to demonstrate that they have a measure of freedom from any kind of fanatical reactions to truth. Forget falsehood, freedom from fanatical reactions to truth. Because when you have a strong intensity of, or even fanatical relationships to ideas, it usually means that you've got an overinvestment of emotion in the idea, and often an identification with it. So the very fact that there's this kind of fanatical emotional intensity can actually indicate that you're too close to it. You're too close to it. We also have to demonstrate here that we're not, as the Tibetan would say, you have to demonstrate freedom from the slavery of ideas. It's an interesting way of putting something, the slavery of ideas. What that's really about is the idea that what enslaves us to an idea, what imprisons us, is when we emotionally attach ourselves to that idea. And that's what enslaves us. So there's this profound idea of retaining that sense of separateness and using the emotions again and not repressing them. This particular initiation is ruled by the sixth ray, because the sixth ray rules the sixth plane, and the sixth plane is the emotional plane. Other things that we also understand are related to this. For instance, the sixth plane, the solar plexus, the whole emotional dimension of life, that's where desire arises. And desire is, of course, the Buddha said that all suffering in the world was due to desire, and esotericism would agree with much of that. And the idea is that it's about molding desire, reshaping desire, transforming desire so that it becomes molded into higher will. So some of the work to be done when it comes to dealing with the desire still in the system is to reshape it into will, and also to how to put this, change that desire also into aspiration. Desire is kind of horizontal in the sense that it's always this sense of wanting this or that experience or that person or this item or anything that draws. It's part of the law of attraction, like I shared with you earlier. But actually, a lot of the second initiation has to do with transforming desire into lofty aspiration, wisely applied. In a way, that's what spiritual aspiration is. Spiritual aspiration could be defined as desire that has been transformed and verticalized within the inner life. And so in many ways, that's a prerequisite to the second initiation. People that are approaching the second initiation find it difficult for a lot of reasons. It is said that between the first and the second, it's a period of time when there's a lot of distress in the path itself. There's always a constant recognition of that something within us, that some aspect of the personality is still getting in the way, still making it difficult. There's a lot of energy in, quote, clearing oneself, to clear oneself. And so there's quite a struggling process over time. And in that sense, it's quite a testing period as well. Now, one of the things that's also quite interesting about it is that another way of looking at it is that, and I'm kind of going to shift gears a little bit to the subject of creativity, but it correlates to this. When you're going to create something, and listen, that's what it's all about, is to be spiritually creative as a function of service. When we take the fire of mind, the new thoughts that are being inspired by the soul, that has a fiery element to it. And when we mix it with water, we get steam, and steam can obscure vision. So sometimes as you're working through the second initiation, there's a sense of uncertainty about where you're going, because this is the phase where you got to deal with the steam, so to speak, and become more masterful. You're also very much related to ideological perspective. So a second degree, or a candidate for the second degree, is somebody who sees much of the world through the lens of ideology, and also some idealism. And that's really one of the big tests, really, because number one, probably the most central ideology theme is one having to do with an insistence on ending separateness. And that's important. I mean, absolutely. The whole journey of service should be rooted in that sense of rising above separateness and doing things in service to with humanity that in some way remove elements of separateness. Okay. Having said that, though, what happens is, because there's a strong idealistic and ideological framework of thought to the candidate approaching the second initiation, what happens is they look at the world and they see how messed up it is. And they see they sense the ideal. They know how it should be. They've had inspiration from above that shows a higher ideal, and they see how far that ideal is from the reality of what's out in the outer world. So the contrast between the inner idealistic vision that the candidate is sensing internally, impulsed by the soul, and its contrast with the real world and the circumstances, and it seems like an insurmountable gulf. The test is, can you establish and hold the point of tension between the two? Now, the term point of tension is an interesting subject, and there's a couple major applications of that term in this philosophy. And one of them pertains to here in this situation. And it's this, that can you hold a point of tension? I should define the term first. A point of tension could be defined as the focused, immovable will. The focused, immovable will. And that's what's required as you approach the second initiation, and to establish a point of tension between the ideals you know are true and must eventually manifest in the outer world, and holding a tension toward the thing in the world that you're recognizing is so far off the mark. Because what happens is, a lot of times when you're you're in this phase of development, you see that disparity and it seems hopeless. There's a sense of, what's the point? There's no way that this is going to get solved. And so a lot of times people kind of, if they may give up or say, oh, there's nothing I can do about this. And so one of the tests, and the masters are watching, is, can you not cave into that perspective, but hold your ideology, the vision you hold that is profoundly wise and true, and can you hold that intention? I don't mean intention as in gritting your teeth. I mean holding that polarity and not letting your emotional body defeat you and cause a surrender and a giving up. And it had said that how long you're able to hold that tension is one of the secrets of the initiation itself. Can you hold that tension? And if you can hold it for a given amount of time, whatever that length is supposed to be, and I don't know what it is, but whatever that length is, that actually is what triggers the initiatory event, the initiatory beginnings of the initiatory process. Again, assuming that also your astrology is fitting into it as well in your terms of transits and progressions. So it's quite a profound thing, the second initiation. So and you might say that a lot of this sort of higher will is being implemented to hold that tension. The second initiation is also a time when you're really demonstrating that internally you're starting to sense or at least some level of a greater awareness of group affiliations. In other words, never forget that you as a soul are part of many groups. The big group, of course, you're a part of is your ashramic group. So let's say you're a second ray soul, you're part of the second ray ashram, and there are billions of souls that are part of that, but many of them are not even on the path yet. But that's one group. But then you're part of other groups. You're part of the new group of world servers, the collective forerunners, but you're also part of other groups that represent certain pieces of work. So you, for instance, you incarnate, and let's say that you incarnate at a point where you're incarnating to do a piece of work in the world to serve on behalf of the ashram, and others are doing the same thing. And so that's an inner group. They may be people you never meet in real physical life, but inwardly they're there. On the other hand, there are some people in your interactions that are actually part of one of the groups that you're part of internally. And so there's a deeper sensitivity to group. There's a deeper sensitivity to recognition of group affiliations that is being demonstrated as you approach the second initiation. You know, the other thing that's important, I mentioned the Antakarana earlier. I think I mentioned it when we were talking about the probationary path, and I mentioned that the Antakarana is starting to be constructed. It's that communication bridge between the soul and the personality. By the time you get to the second initiation, it's not completely built yet, but you're very conscious of it. You're very conscious of this, you might say, this inner gateway. And you're conscious of the fact that you're getting greater clarity, greater alignment. Alignments work much easier, even in meditation. You should be able to create an inner alignment in a with greater speed than you had in the past. All because the Antakarana is becoming more and more built. Every time you meditate, you're supporting the building of the Antakarana. Every time you commit yourself to heartfelt service, you're supporting the building of the Antakarana. But there's a much more conscious element to it as part of the preparation for the second initiation. You know, it's so interesting because the second initiation is called the baptism. So you're going to, as I said at the beginning, there's a kind of Christian theme to it. So the first initiation was the birth of the Christ. So the theme of birth. Well, in Christianity, the virgin birth notion is very central to the spiritual view in the Christian canon. Now we have the baptismal initiation, and it connects to water, of course, and so we can see the connection there. And so the story in the Bible of the baptism is one of the references in a certain symbolic way to the second initiation. But interestingly, there's even another reference to it in the sense of the story of Jesus walking on water. Did Jesus really walk on water? I don't know. I think probably, but that's the amazing thing is that's the least important question. Because you see, it's a symbol for all of us. It's a symbol that says, hey, at a certain point in your evolution, second initiation, we must demonstrate our capacity to walk on water. Not literally walk on water, but hold ourselves above the watery sphere of our personality, which is the emotional body. So the whole story of walking on water is much more important as a metaphor for us, for each of us, to learn how to hold ourselves above the emotionally watery nature of the personality rather than being submerged in it and suffer the consequences of the challenges around being immersed in emotion. You see, that's the deeper meaning behind this. So it's a very difficult initiation, as I say, and it's a few incarnations to get there. Okay, so now before I go on to the third initiation, is there any questions you'd like to ask about this one? And if you don't mind, if we could, if possible, let's stay on this particular subject. So any questions?
this might be a bit self-evident, but do you think that the second initiation then is trying for us because we're predominantly water beings? You know, we have such a high percentage of water in our earthly bodies.
Well, it's not that we are watery beings, it's that our physical body is watery beings. In fact, that is an important answer, because right there, we have to start to make this separation between the form and ourselves. That's really actually important. But that's also why it's difficult, is because, yes, I would agree with you, though, in what you're trying to get at, is that because our bodies are so water-based, that it's reasonable to assume that that too contributes to the challenge of the second initiation. But I'll give you another reason. Two other reasons. One is that the emotional plane is the plane that emphasizes duality more than any other, the so-called pairs of opposites. And, you know, so we have a long history of wanting to feel good and avoid bad feelings. And so there's this natural tendency to gravitate and shape consciousness around things that feel good, not things that feel bad. And that polarity is pervasive. And yet, in fact, the emotional body, the more you feel good, whether you feel bad or good, both of those are actually not the ideal condition. The ideal condition is to be in the middle. As the Buddha would say, follow the noble middle path. Well, that also applies to the question of emotion and positive emotion versus negative emotion. So that's one reason why it's challenging. Another reason, and this, I have to take you a little bit into cosmos, friends. Hope you don't mind, but we're going to go into the big picture for just a minute. The planetary logos, now that's the entity that ensouls our whole planet and is a god to us. In this literature, in the esoteric philosophy, there's quite a bit of discussion about its evolution, because it's an imperfect God. And we're just cells of consciousness within its beingness. Well, on a cosmic scale, we're told that our planet is approaching a second in cosmic initiation. Now, it's much, much higher, much bigger than our little human experience with it, but it has a reflection. So because the planetary logos is approaching and working toward a second cosmic initiation, and it's very close to achieving it, it's only a couple million years from now, so it's like tomorrow, okay? And you have to think about time in a different way, friends, when you're working with some of this. But it has a reflection down on the human level in terms of the challenge that we therefore are going to deal with when kind of going through that. So, yeah, those are the other reasons why. By the way, I meant to mention that another thing that's important about the second initiation is that the law of service, and there's 7 laws of the soul, and the law of service is the 3rd law. It is said that the law of service must begin to manifest itself, or the destroying aspect of itself, at this time. Now, what do I mean by destroying? Okay, what I mean is that the causal body naturally has an urge to serve. I mentioned that earlier. It's built into the causal body's nature. But when we say it starts to develop the destroying aspect of service, it doesn't mean going out and destroying things. It means looking at one's life. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, well, so it means looking at one's life, committing yourself to service, and looking at where in your life are things placed in your life that need to be severed or destroyed in order that you can more fully bring the best of you forward in service. So it's not destruction of something external, it's destructive of something or things that are preventing more of the best of you from coming forward in service. And so there's a discernment that has to be made about what do I relinquish, we'll call that destruction, versus what I can't relinquish, even though I might like to, because I have a karmic responsibility here. So there's this idea of discerning what parts of my life that do have a limiting effect, what parts of my life are they're limiting because I have a responsibility and therefore I have a karmic element to this that I have to work through naturally, versus what do I eliminate that really, if I just made up my mind to do that, I could cut that out and become much more effective. So you really look at your life in that lens as well. Yeah. So
Thank you. We just have a question from the floor. What? We just have a question from the floor from Annette. Is Saturn involved in this?
Saturn is involved in everything. I'll tell you why. Here, I'll give you a little metaphor about Saturn to help you. Saturn is the planet that is most distant from the sun that you can see with the naked eye. Because everything beyond Saturn, Neptune and Uranus and Pluto, those you can't see. You have to have a telescope. So symbolically, Saturn rules the frontier between the seen worlds and the unseen worlds. Well, what is that metaphorically? Well, the seen worlds are the day-to-day aspects of our consciousness. And what is the unseen world? The unseen world is the world of the soul and the spirit beyond. And Saturn sits right at the boundary, right at the gate. And Saturn says, you want to enter into the unseen world? And you want to have more permanence there? Instead of just occasionally having a brief glimpse? Saturn says, no problem. I can make that happen. Here's what you must do first. Saturn insists that you earn your way to enlightenment. That's why it's my favorite planet. No question. It's a tough planet, but it's my favorite planet. And it's also the Lord of Karma, because every initiation, you're rising above measures of karma, and so Saturn will be involved in that. The only time Saturn starts to loosen its grip is after the third initiation. Saturn's influence diminishes at that time, at least within a human context. Okay.
Okay.
So don't try to run from Saturn. You're going to lose that race, I'll tell you. We're good to go. Okay. All right. Now, I want to spend a chunk of time on the third initiation. And this one is a whole different game. And just to refresh your memory, I'm going to bring that image back up again. And this image is what I want you to look at again. So I said, so this area here is like kind of equivalent to the first initiation. Now we've got more infusion. And that's what's happening. When we talk about how we want to transform the emotional body, what we're really saying is we're trying to do that and therefore support more soul infusion into the personality. So much of the second initiation has to do with demonstrated soulful mastery over the emotional dimension of the personality. It's not 100%, but it certainly has the upper hand. Now, this is where we're going now. We're moving into this whole regime. And this is the world of the initiate, the third initiation. Now, the third initiation is a whole different kind of thing, Once you take the second initiation, as I said, it is even possible to take the third initiation in the same life. But if not, it's likely the next incarnation. Now, it is said in some of the language of esotericism by the masters, it is said that when a person takes the second initiation, it is said that they step into the stream, is the wording. They step into the stream. And the stream has a current to it. And that current is taking them toward the third initiation. And it is said that that current, as you approach the third initiation, the closer you get to it, the faster the current, the stronger the current. And we are told that when you reach the halfway point between those two initiations while in this stream, keep in mind, this is a metaphor, but you're getting the idea. That is an important point. We call it the 2.5 mark, if you want to be exact about it, the 2.5 mark. And we're told that at that point, that's when you're given a new title, as opposed to by the masters. They see you with a slightly different light once you reach the 2.5 mark, and that you're called a trusted disciple, because at the 2.5 mark, it is said that the current is so strong that you as a personality could not pull yourself out of it even if you tried. You're therefore trusted. Stated in a different way, at that point, you cannot step out of the evolutionary regime you're in and choose to then follow the what is sometimes called the dark path or the left-hand path, that sort of thing. Or sometimes it's called the path of Mahat, which is dark magic and the darker forces. So up until then, and there's still enough personality on its own that you could pull yourself out. You know, they say, for instance, Hitler was a second-degree initiate. Now, I'm always surprised by the fact that you could take the first and the second initiation, meaning you face the Christ twice, because the Christ is the Hierophant for both the first and the second initiations. You could face the Christ twice and still decide, I think I'll go the other way. I just find that an astounding thing. But apparently there are cases like that. So it's still, up until that point, you're still being tested to see, are you the real thing? Can you really do this? Can you really follow this to its end? So that transition is really important. It's also a period that in another language, it's called the chela on the thread. Now that's in this philosophy, there's two streams that speak of the journey to enlightenment. One stream is what we're doing today, which is the whole stream of initiation. And it's really speaking of how we, what we have to do internally to transform ourselves, and what does that mean to service in the outer world. And the other stream is called the 6 stages of discipleship. And that's a little different in discussion, because that has to do with measures of intimacy with the inner ashram. So, and one of those stages, a fairly high stage, is called the chela on the thread. The word chela is another word for disciple. When you get to the 2.5 mark, you now become a chela on the thread, which means that thread is said to be, it's just a metaphor, but it's said to be an energetic connection with the ashram. And so it's not tenuous anymore. And literally, they use the metaphor of when in an emergency, the master at the center of the ashram is holding the other end of that thread. And you've come to the point in your evolution where in an emergency, a spiritual emergency, symbolically, you could pull that thread and you would get a response from the master. In other words, the intimacy with the ashram and even the master is now much more heightened at this point of development. So you're not a 3rd degree initiate yet, but you're kind of almost there. You're just right at the border with it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about the 3rd initiation, because it's said to be a whole different regime in a certain sense. The first thing is that it is said that at the 3rd initiation, the sun of mind is fully emerged. Now, the term son, S-O-N, of mind, is a kind of arcane reference or title of the consciousness of the causal body. Your causal body throughout history has had different terms to identify it. And one of them is it's son of mind. It's the son or the child of universal mind. So the son of mind. And it's fully emerged. In other words, you get to the third initiation, you're in the causal body. Your place of polarization, remember what polarization means, where your resting consciousness is. Your resting consciousness is now in the causal body. It's not something you're striving for any longer. But to get there, you have to demonstrate a couple of things. One of the things is that you have to show that now you're demonstrating mastery or relative mastery over the mental body of the personality. So the first initiation is mastery of the physical, second initiation, emotional, third, mental body. And because of that, it's the whole personality that's now in the game. And so now you have full soul and personality fusion rather than partial fusion. Complete soul personality fusion. And that's very triumphant. And this, by the way, and that's why at the third initiation, you are now in another regime in terms of the initiation itself, the actual ceremonial part of it. Because unlike the Christ who officiated the first two initiations, by the time you get to the third initiation, the Christ steps aside and you are presented to Sanat Kumara himself. And Sanat Kumara becomes the initiator. And the Christ is the being that is presenting you. I mean, it's an amazing thought. And it's really, really interesting to think about, because it actually explains why it is that in the occult literature around these initiations, it is said that the first and the second initiation are sometimes called the initiations on the threshold. The initiations on the threshold. They're on the threshold of what? Well, they're on the threshold of entrance into the ashram, inner entrance into the ashram. When you get to the third initiation, you're at that place where you're on the threshold into the ashram itself. Up to that point, you're still part of the ashram in a probationary sense. You're still subtly being influenced by it, but you're more like in its aura. But now you're stepping into it in a much more fuller way. To use my simple analogy or my simple drama that I couldn't dramatize, it's when you got both feet in, but you're leaning against the door that you just went through. Okay? So it's a whole different kind of thing. And now your whole lower self is purified enough. It's not fully purified, but purified enough that you can take the voltage of the initiation, you can take it directly from Sanat Kumara instead of having it mitigated or softened by the love of the Christ, who then. So that's why the Christ is the initiator for the first and the second initiation, because the power, the electric power from the rod of initiation as wielded by Sanat Kumara is incredibly powerful. And if your system didn't have the right measure of purity in it, and you were applied, that rod was being applied to you, you'd be ashes. I'm probably dramatizing it a little bit, but you get the idea. Whereas the Christ is the intermediary in the first two initiations, because the agency of profound love is also an agency of softening. So it takes that current and steps it down and softens it so your system can handle it at the first and the second. But at the third, Sanat Kumara. There's a fun kind of way that it's discussed in the literature. It is said that at the third initiation, it is said you see his star shine forth. You see his star shine forth. His is a reference to Sanat Kumara for the first time. In other words, you sense Sanat Kumara, but very tenuously. It's just you see a star shine forth. It's not and you understand, it's not a visual seeing, it's an inner realization seeing. At the fourth initiation, it is said that you meet Sanat Kumara as the initiator eye to eye. And at the fifth initiation, face to face. These are just metaphors of measures of intimacy and connectedness and proximity to Sanat Kumara's influence. So, but the third initiation is where that first glimmer of it is occurring. Now, keep in mind that that third initiation is also the place, because the soul and the personality are completely fused. I'm going to bring that image back up here because I want to highlight this. Because this duality is now fused here as one, that's what makes it possible for you to wake up and recognize a higher polarity, a higher pole now. It's only because the lower duality is resolved into a singularity that you realize that that is a lower pole to a yet higher duality within you. And that's the awakening to the monad itself, even though it's still just a brief, not a brief, it's a momentary experience. And it's very similar in a certain sense to the waking up to the soul at the time of the awakening so much earlier. You know, let me share with you another way of looking at this. And I used to kind of dramatize this too in the old days when I wasn't on a screen. Think about your causal body for a minute. Now, your causal body is this storehouse of wisdom that you've earned. We've each have earned our wisdom. And again, it's naturally a Christ energy as well. In a certain sense, the first two initiations are simply measuring how close you can inwardly hold yourself in the proximity of that causal body. Now, look at the causal body as a library. In fact, it's sometimes been called the repository. Mm-hmm. It's also been called the treasury, because truthfully, friends, there's nothing more valuable in the world than the content of your causal body. It's more valuable than all the gold in the world. And your causal body is a vast storehouse of acquired wisdom. And so picture it as a library. Now, and that every incarnation, you're getting more books stored in this library because those are books that you wrote. The only difference between the books in a real library and the books in this inner library is, in a real library, the books are it's filled with books of multiple authors. But in this library, one author, and you're it. Because everything, all the wisdom is part of what you've earned, part of your story of incarnational history. Now, when you finally get on this initiatory path, it's like at the first initiation, let's say that something happens in life and you realize, I need to access deeper wisdom in me. So you kind of look inside, you kind of go for a minute and pause and sense, do I have an answer to that? And what you're doing is you're actually going into the causal body, and you're kind of looking in the causal body and go, do I have a book for this? There I do. Yeah. Grab the book. Yes, this is how I'll respond. The second initiation is when you're not living in the library, but you're kind of living outside the door. So the second initiation is just a manifestation of a greater ease at finding that place of wisdom deep inside quickly and acquiring what it is you need to facilitate something you're doing in the outer world. But the third initiation is when you now live in the library. That's where consciousness is now polarized. And that's again why I say that it becomes the lower polarized point to a yet higher duality, and that's the awakening to the monad. And to continue the story of the library, let me share with you how that monad comes into view. So imagine this, you're living in this library filled with books that you wrote called wisdom. Now let's say that there's several floors to this library, and every floor, the books on each of the floors are higher wisdom that you've acquired over countless incarnations. So let's say you're on the top floor. And let's say that you happen to be looking at a book on the top shelf of the top floor. And the ceiling to the library is right above your head. At the third initiation, you're not just there, but suddenly the ceiling opens up. It's like it rips apart. And you look up, and there's this blazing ball of fire and power like a sun. And it's so strong that it's the monad you're sensing for the first time in a conscious way. Monad's been in the picture for so long. Remember, you were a monad in the mineral kingdom. It's the same monad, but now you've lifted your consciousness where you can actually become conscious of it. And it's said to be so powerful. It's like an atomic bomb. Inches from your nose. It is said to be both an incredibly terrifying inner realization, while simultaneously and paradoxically, one of the most joyous experiences you'll have. It's both terrifying and joyous at the same time, a paradox to be sure. And so suddenly this comes into view, and then boom, the curtain shuts. And you just fall back and go, what in the world has happened? It's kind of like, by analogy, when we had the awakening at the beginning of the probationary path, and you woke up to the soul for the first time, but it was fleeting, and then it went away. In a certain sense, that's what's happening on a higher turn of the spiral, many incarnations later at the third initiation, but now you're waking up to the monad for the first time, and then it seems to disappear. Now, and then what happens is you're going to start more consciously in your meditative life to see if you can find that door in the ceiling. The causal body has two entrance points in a way. The normal entrance point is how we go into find the wisdom. But at the highest, subtlest reaches of that field of wisdom in you is another door. And there's a whole meditation regime around kind of finding that second door. And how you know there's a second door is because you had this one experience that said it's there. I experienced it. Now, the other thing about this is that a third degree initiate has been called a couple different things. In kind of Christian language, it's been called the rich young man in Christ. In esoteric language, it's also called the world disciple. The world disciple. What we mean by that is that an initiate of the third degree, his or her influence in terms of serving humanity will have global implications, either in the life or often as a legacy to the life. And yet, interestingly, a fair amount of them actually work behind the scenes. But their effect will have a rippling effect on a global scale, the world disciple. The Christian reference to the rich young man is a reference to, well, in the Christian story, you may recall the story of the rich young man who approached Jesus and wanted to follow Jesus, and Jesus told him to give all his wealth and material things to him, and he could follow. And remember the story, the rich young man went sadly away. And there's a kind of a correlation, because a third degree initiate lives in a joyous, a very powerfully influential, positive field of service. But very interestingly, when that ceiling opens and you had your first glimpse of the monad internally and then it closed, even though it closed, it is said that a seed of foreboding was planted deep within you. Just as there was kind of a seed planted, as I said earlier, at the awakening. This is another seed, a seed of foreboding, because you're getting a little bit of a hint of what's coming at the fourth initiation. And if you knew what was happening at the fourth initiation, it's no wonder you want to hang around as long as you can as a third degree initiate. Believe me, and you'll see why in a minute. But this is why the Tibetan says that the greatest challenge to a third degree initiate is the problem of sloth, of all things, sloth. But it's a world disciple in the sense that and some of the most powerful, positive people in history, we believe, have been third degree initiates. People like Abraham Lincoln, probably Gandhi, probably somebody like Nelson Mandela. We even speculate that possibly even somebody like Mikhail Gorbachev may have been a third degree initiate. Now, they're coming from different ray lines. So Mikhail Gorbachev, if we're speculating correctly, he would have been along the first ray line. So he would have, if he were a third degree initiate, he would have likely come through the first ray ashram, because that ashram has a huge emphasis on serving humanity through executive positions, and also it's the ray that governs all of government and politics and that sort of thing. While a person like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, they would have more likely come out of the second ray ashram or the sixth ray ashram. So they look quite different in that sense, but they're just coming from a different ashramic source. So the world disciple. Now, and therefore, at the third initiation, that's when you have a sense of purpose coming in two places. It's coming in because now you've awoken to the monad for the first time. Monad is pure being. Monad is life. Monad is beyond consciousness. But it's also the source of the highest manifestation of purpose within you. But also the ashram. You're also now on the thread, and you're also in the ashram, but leaning against the door. And that's also a source of purpose. So by the time you get to the third initiation, you know your ashramic responsibility, at least the fundamentals of it at that point. You no longer have any inclinations to become led by the heresy of separateness that I mentioned earlier. You've transcended illusion. And you don't even have aspiration anymore. Aspiration, that lofty aspiration that was, remember, transforming desire into lofty aspiration, which is very connected to the second initiation. By the time you get to the third initiation, you rise above the aspirational life, it fades away, and now nothing is needing to push you to become soul. Now you are. You reach the target that you've been aiming at all along. As you approach the third initiation, it is we've been told that much personal karma that still resides, a lot of it is shedding very quickly as you approach the third initiation. A lot of it is falling away. And a third degree initiate is able to pass into the causal body at will. In other words, a third degree initiate could be sitting here right with you, and through just mere will themselves into the causal body immediately. As opposed to you and I, where we have to meditate, we have to kind of massage our way up to that subtler realm. A third degree initiate, it's just sort of like an open gateway. And at the fourth initiation, you'll never leave it. But at the third initiation, you're there. And so this is why purpose and why your capacity to serve is so great. The world disciple, the reason why your work will have global ramifications is because you're no longer a divided house. The soul and the personality are no longer distinctly different. They're fused as one. And when you have full fusion, what happens is you get synergy, in the sense that the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And that's what happens. That's why a third degree initiate, his or her work in the world will have that much more expansive quality to it. While most of us are working within the context of our immediate environment, a third degree initiate's radiatory influence is far greater than that. And that's the promise for all of us in some incarnation. All of us will become third degree initiates someday. And in fact, that whole subject is actually what the foundation of this, as I say, this workshop I'll be doing in Nelson in early March. It's a lot about understanding that more deeply and what we can individually do to help facilitate that, getting closer to that. It's ruled by the fifth ray, friends. This particular initiation is governed by the fifth ray. And that makes sense because the fifth ray is the ray that governs the fifth plane, and the fifth plane is the mental plane. And also the fifth ray is very connected to the fifth kingdom of nature, which is the one that now as a third degree initiate, you're kind of in the periphery, standing, leaning against the door. So it's quite powerful in that sense, very powerful. You know, speaking of it from a biblical point of view, there's a wonderful story. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this. I'm so sorry. I should have said this right at the beginning. What is this initiation called? It's called the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration. You may recall in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, there's a story called the Transfiguration on the Mount. I think it's found in a couple places in the canon somewhere. And I could dig it up. I have the quote here, but I'll just tell you what it's about. It's a story about how Jesus is accompanied by 3 disciples to climb up to the top of a mountain. The 3 disciples were John, James, and Peter. And they get to the top of the mountain, and there's a whole part of the story where some of the old prophets from the Old Testament, like Moses and Elijah, show up. And that part is not so important for what I want to share with you. But what happens is that it is said that suddenly Jesus became this glowing ball of light. And this is what they call the Transfiguration on the Mount. He became this glowing ball of light, and it was so sacred and so brilliant that all 3 disciples fell on their faces in reverence and prostrated themselves in reverence. And while on their faces, they hear that it is said that the sky opened up, or the clouds opened up, something like that. And a booming voice from God, from the sky, speaks to those disciples and says, "This is my son," representing Jesus. "This is my son, of whom I am well pleased. Follow him." And so then they lift their eyes up and sit up, and now Jesus is back to his normal self. And that whole story is called the Transfiguration on the Mount. But that's a metaphor for the third initiation, because it is believed, it's understood that those 3 disciples are symbolic of the 3 parts of the personality. So, for instance, it is said that Peter was the rock of the church. You've heard this, the rock of the church. Well, physical body. James was called the deceiver, emotional body. And John has correlation to the mental body. And all of them must bow in reverence and yield to the radiance of the Christ energy, stated occultly, the radiance of your own causal body, which is the Christ in you. And the booming voice, friends, the booming voice that speaks, that's the monad. That's the monad speaking. Let me give you a little bit of a distinction here. See the soul in you as the Christ in you. See the monad in you as the God in you. That's the story of the Transfiguration, and that's the story of that'll be true for all of us, So the transfiguration is a remarkable thing,
I just wonder if your expression about the evolution of mankind and in that Mona positions will really represent all the leaders who are selected by the masters to rule the world. And would you apply that to one of the law of nature that says what is above is below, meaning the different levels of stratas on mankind. So when somebody became a leader in any organization, is what is above is below. Even in this exoteric level, we're talking about developing ourselves to reach that level of the house. Would that be a similar comparison? And those leaders who have the people are supposed to be responsible for them, their evolution, whatever level they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I understand your question right, there's two types of leaders in the world: enlightened and unenlightened. And so I mean, it's that simple. So the rise today, you see a lot of rise of autocratic leadership. That's a much lower level. That's all about integrated personality without any soul infusion. I'm not going to name names, but there's one well in this country. Okay. But then there's some really enlightened leaders who are they rise because of their wisdom, and they're committed to the welfare of the larger whole. And so that manifests in the kind of way that we're talking about. They're people that are very, they have a lot of soul infusion, and in some cases, they may actually be initiates. That's why I say an initiate will have a large scale influence on a wide variety of, a wide spectrum of people in an uplifting, positive way. So I think that is the question you asked. I hope I got it right anyway.